There is a name that became the Greek word for nightmare. Not a myth, not a monster, a real man who lived and breathed and walked these mountains and who made one decision on one night that the ancient world never forgave. His name was Ephialtes, and in 480 BC, he walked into the camp of the largest army the world had ever seen, and he told them exactly how to destroy the 300 warriors standing between Persia and the conquest of everything Greece had ever built. You already know the story of the 300 Spartans. You have seen the films, you have heard the speeches, you know the pass, the shields, the last stand. But you do not know the full story. You do not know what happened to the man who caused it. You do not know the real reason Xerxes ultimately failed. And you do not know what history quietly did with the truth once the battle was over. This is history, and this is the source code underneath the legend. To understand what Ephialtes did and why it still matters, you need to understand the world he destroyed. In 480 BC, the Persian Empire was the largest civilization the Earth had ever produced. It stretched from the borders of modern India, across Persia and Mesopotamia, through Egypt and up into the edges of Europe. Its king was Xerxes I, son of Darius, a man who believed, with the complete certainty of someone who had never been refused anything, that the gods had chosen him to rule the entire known world. The one piece of that world that kept refusing to submit was Greece, a collection of small, fractious, permanently arguing city-states that had humiliated his father at the Battle of Marathon 10 years earlier. Xerxes was not coming to negotiate. He was not coming to discuss terms. He was coming to erase that humiliation from history permanently. Ancient sources describe his army as so vast it drank rivers dry as it marched. Modern historians estimate between 100,000 and 300,000 soldiers, all of them moving toward a single point, a narrow strip of land between a cliff face and the Aegean Sea, where a Spartan king named Leonidas had decided, against everything that looked like reasonable military logic, to make his stand. That strip of land was called Thermopylae, the Hot Gates, named for the sulfur springs that rose from the earth nearby. At its narrowest point, the pass was wide enough for perhaps 15 men to stand side by side, no more than that. And Leonidas understood something about warfare that Xerxes was about to learn at devastating cost. In a sufficiently narrow pass, the size of your army becomes almost completely irrelevant. You cannot flank, you cannot surround. You can only send men forward in waves and watch them die against whatever is waiting at the bottleneck. What was waiting at Thermopylae was Spartan. For 3 full days, the Persian army attacked, wave after wave, including the Immortals, Xerxes' elite personal guard, 10,000 of the finest soldiers in the empire, sent forward and driven back. The Spartans rotated their fighters in and out of the front line with a precision that looked inhuman to the Persians watching from the rear. They held formation. They did not tire. They did not break. Xerxes, sitting on his golden throne on the hillside above the pass, reportedly rose from his seat 3 times in alarm at what he was witnessing. His unstoppable army stopped, and he had no answer for it. Then, after dark on the 3rd day, a man came to the Persian camp. A local Greek from the mountain region of Malis. A man who knew these cliffs and these paths the way only someone born among them could know them. He introduced himself as Ephialtes, and he told Xerxes that there was a second path, a narrow mountain trail called the Anopaia, winding through the cliffs above Thermopylae, coming out directly behind the Greek position at the pass. A path the Spartan sentries did not know was being used, a path that would make everything Leonidas had built over 3 days of fighting completely worthless. We do not know with certainty what Ephialtes wanted in return. Ancient sources suggest money, land under Persian rule. Some historians believe he carried a personal grievance against Sparta, though the nature of that grievance has been lost entirely to time. What we know is simple. Xerxes believed him, and that night 10,000 Persian elite soldiers followed Ephialtes into the darkness of the mountain. A Greek force of 1,000 soldiers from the city of Phocis had been stationed on the Anapaia path for exactly this reason, to guard against this possibility. When they heard the Persians moving through the pre-dawn forest, through the sound of leaves crushed underfoot in the darkness, they retreated to higher ground rather than hold their position. They sent a runner to warn Leonidas. Leonidas received the warning as the sun was rising. He understood immediately what it meant. The pass was finished. The Persians would emerge behind them within hours. He called his Greek allies together and sent them away. The soldiers from Corinth, from Thebes, from the other city-states. There was no reason for all of them to die now that the tactical position had collapsed completely. But Leonidas stayed, with his 300 Spartans, and with 700 volunteer soldiers from the small city of Thespia, men with families, men with farms, men who had every reason to leave and no military obligation to remain. Every one of them refused to go. They fought until the last man fell. The Persians took no Spartan prisoners. Xerxes, in a fury that reveals exactly how deeply 3 days of resistance had wounded his pride, ordered the body of Leonidas beheaded and his head displayed on a spike, an act so contrary to Persian tradition, so dishonorable by the standards of the ancient world that even Persian court historians recorded their discomfort at it. And then Xerxes marched south, into Greece, into Athens. He burned the city to the ground, the temples on the Acropolis, structures that had stood for centuries, reduced to ash and rubble. It looked, to everyone watching, like the end. But Thermopylae was not the moment that decided the war. It was the moment that bought Greece enough time to set up the moment that did. The Athenian general Themistocles had spent years preparing for exactly this scenario. He had studied Persian tactics. He understood their fleet, and he understood one thing above all else. Xerxes needed his navy. Without it, he could not supply an army of that size through a Greek winter. Without it, he could not hold what he had conquered. The fleet was the vulnerability, and the fleet could be destroyed, but only in the right place. That place was the Strait of Salamis, a narrow channel of water between the island of Salamis and the Athenian coast. In open water, the Persian fleet of over 1,000 ships would overwhelm the smaller Greek navy through sheer numbers alone. But in a narrow strait, the same principle that had governed Thermopylae applied equally to ships. Numbers become a problem. Maneuver becomes impossible. And the side that knows the water has an enormous advantage over the side that does not. Themistocles needed to get the Persian fleet into that strait. So he sent Xerxes a message. The message claimed to come from a Greek sympathetic to Persia. It warned the Persian king that the Greek fleet was planning to escape through the northern exit of the strait during the night, that if Xerxes wanted to destroy the Greek navy, he had to move immediately, seal both exits before dawn, catch them before they slipped away. Every word of it was a lie. Xerxes believed it completely. He ordered his fleet into the Strait of Salamis in darkness, splitting his forces to cover both exits, driving his ships into exactly the confined water where their numbers became a liability rather than a weapon. The Persian fleet lost all formation in the darkness and the confusion of the narrow channel. Ships collided with their own allies. Oars snapped against neighboring hulls. Commanders could not communicate across the chaos. When dawn broke and the Greek fleet attacked, it was not a battle. It was a demolition.
The Battle of Salamis lasted 1 day. By evening, the Persian fleet had been destroyed. Not retreated, not damaged and withdrawn. Destroyed. Xerxes watched it happen from a throne set up on the shore, surrounded by his scribes, who had come prepared to record a great imperial victory for the royal archives. Instead, they recorded the worst military disaster in Persian history. Without his fleet, Xerxes could not supply his army through the winter. He retreated to Persia. He left a general named Mardonius behind with a substantial force to attempt to hold what had been conquered. The following year, the Greeks defeated that remaining army at the Battle of Plataea, and the invasion was over. The empire that had seemed unstoppable, the army that had drunk rivers dry, the king who believed the gods had appointed him to rule the world, turned back. By a narrow pass that bought 3 days, by a naval strait that ended a fleet in 1 morning, and by a single fabricated message delivered to a king who trusted it. At the center of all of it, the single hinge on which the entire story turned, was one man on a mountain path in the darkness, leading 10,000 soldiers toward the rear of 300 men who would be dead by morning. So what happened to Ephialtes? He fled into the mountains of Thessaly. He disappeared from the main stage of history almost immediately after the betrayal. The Greeks placed a bounty on his name. He became one of the most wanted men in the ancient world, a symbol of treachery so total, so complete, that his name stopped being just a name and became something else entirely. But he was never caught. He was never brought to trial. He was never executed for what he did at Thermopylae. Years later, a man named Athenades found him and killed him, but not for the betrayal, for an entirely unrelated personal dispute. Ephialtes died, but not as a traitor receiving the justice the story seems to require. He died as a man who had simply made the wrong enemy in the wrong place at the wrong moment in a life that had already outlasted every attempt to cut it short. History does not always punish the guilty. It does not always reward the brave. The 300 Spartans who died at the pass were given a monument that still stands at Thermopylae today. The inscription carved into the stone has survived for 2,500 years. Go tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here, obedient to their laws, we lie. Ephialtes received a different kind of monument. The Greeks took his name and pressed it permanently into their language as the word for the worst dream a sleeping mind can produce. Every person who has ever woken in the dark from a terror they cannot explain, shaking and breathless from something that felt horribly real and left no evidence behind, has been speaking the name of Ephialtes without knowing it. He escaped the justice of his own time. He did not escape the memory of history. And Themistocles, the man who actually saved Greece, the general who engineered the destruction of the Persian fleet with a single fabricated letter. He was later accused of collaborating with the very empire he had defeated, convicted on evidence that most historians now believe was entirely manufactured by his political enemies, exiled from the city of Athens, the city he had evacuated, protected, and ultimately rescued. He spent the remainder of his life as a guest of the Persian Empire, welcomed by the successors of Xerxes, given land and position by the rulers of the civilization he had broken at Salamis. He died there. The past is not a clean story. It never was. The heroes are not always rewarded. The traitors are not always punished. The men who save civilizations are not always thanked by them. What history does, with a consistency that should unsettle anyone paying close attention, is remember. And sometimes the way it chooses to remember is stranger and darker and more honest than anything a classroom was ever willing to teach. I take the events everyone thinks they know, and I show you what is underneath them. If this gave you something you did not have before, subscribe.
A new episode every single week, and the next one goes even deeper than this one did.